Okay, so I'm making a video about this guy again. So I think I made a video on this thing in October. So to refresh, this is the Panasonic JT-H300HT. This is a handheld made by obviously Panasonic, released in around 2008 or so. So it runs Windows CE 6, and that's really going to be the more important thing of what I'm trying to make this stupid video about, because this video is going to be explaining, I guess what you would call it, the quirks of this handheld, because this handheld operates in a very weird way than compared to other Windows CE handhelds. You know, it's special. Okay, it's like that special kid in the kindergarten classroom that never shuts the fuck up. Yeah, that was my kindergarten experience. That's this thing. So, yeah. So this is not your typical. Dolphin 6100 or whatever the hell. This is a different animal right here. Okay, because this thing is weird. So, to preface, to understand what the hell I'm trying to say here, I need to first briefly explain Windows CE. Okay, I think there's a very common misconception I see with Windows CE. I see online. I'm not gonna call myself a Windows CE oracle. I'm not. Okay, that sounds very version like, and I'm really not that. But the thing is that Windows CE, I see a lot of people make retarded mentions online, calling Windows CE a like mini Windows 95 or whatever the fuck. Okay, look, let me make this very clear. Windows CE and Windows 95 are two completely different OSs. They are under the same Windows family. They're made by the same company, that being Microsoft. But Windows 95 and Windows 98 operate in two completely different realms. To clarify, to get to the point, Windows 95 is a persistent OS. So you would install Windows 95 on a hard drive. A hard drive is obviously a persistent form of storage. So regardless whether you switch off your tower or you restart it or whatever the hell, essentially when the tower loses power, Windows 95 is still going to keep your settings, it's still going to keep your documents, it's still going to keep everything. Windows CE does not function like that. Windows CE is a RAM-based OS. Windows CE is a OS that loads from your ROM. So it could be a ROM card, ROM flash, or whatever the hell. It loads for your ROM. So it loads the image, the MK image, from your ROM over to your RAM whenever you cold boot the device. So, for example, if this is the very first time that you have switched on a Windows CE device, you're going to notice that it's going to take more longer to cold boot than it does to warm boot. That is because it is copying over the image over to RAM. Your RAM is your playground. So you obviously are not able to store any documents in the ROM because the ROM is read-only. So your RAM is where you would store your documents and all your programs and all, whatever the hell. And obviously this poses a huge issue right here. The RAM is temporary storage. How RAM works is that when the power is off, cleared, your data is cleared, is gone. So what people did to rectify this is to put in backup batteries into Windows CE devices. So that means even when your main battery is gone, flat, you will at least still have a bit more time for you to charge your CE device. And charge the CE device. So that means you won't lose all your settings. In the event that both batteries fail, that's where ActiveSync comes in. They would have expected you, Microsoft would have, or your OEM, whatever the hell, would have already expected you that you synced your device before such an event has happened like that. But that's the main point I'm trying to make here. Okay, Windows CE is a RAM-based OS. Okay, Windows CE is an OS that does not save any of your settings. So it would save your settings when it still has power, but when the power is gone, your data is gone. So Windows CE, this is why you don't see it with a this is why you don't see a shutdown option, only a suspend option, because the suspend is obviously going to keep it in a very low powered state that's going to keep your data still, but it's not going to completely drain out the battery like it does if it's in a normal power on state. But anyways, the thing is that this Panasonic, the H300 and the H320 operate very differently than compared to a normal Windows CE device. So, for example, the Dolphin 6100. The Dolphin 6100 operates in the same thing as I was explaining before with any other typical Windows CE device. So, if you cold boot it, if you cold boot the device via the key combinations or whatever the hell, or you pull out the battery and wait for the backup battery to die, then the device is factory resetted. It's cleared. If you warm boot the device, it's obviously going to still keep your settings because warm booting is rebooting it. Now, this Panasonic, how this Panasonic is that obviously when you cold boot the device, it clears your data. When you cold boot the device, it still clears your data, like any other Windows CE device. But when you warm boot this device, it's gonna clear partially some data while still keeping some. So it clears some things, but then it also keeps some other things. So let me switch on this device and let me explain right here. So this is it right here, okay? So let me see if I can. Okay, so you see, obviously it's a standard Windows CE desktop, all that bullshit, okay? You know, this is the control panel, is a very bare control panel, is really nothing, okay? So when you warm boot the device, it's almost like you're cold booting it, because when you warm boot the device, it's not going to be keeping all your settings. So for example, I go here, owner information. It's gonna keep my owner information. Even when I cold boot the device, I realize that this thing does seem to keep a basic form of persistency. That being that it still keeps at least your ownership information and that type of stuff. But obviously it clears out your documents and stuff. But when you warm boot the device, it still keeps that type of stuff, and obviously it still keeps your settings. Jesus Christ, you know, it still keeps the settings and the documents and that type of stuff. But anything that you would have custom configured is gone. So what do I mean by this? So these are the utility programs I was mentioning in the other video I made about this thing, that I literally had to fetch them from some fucking Chinese website because they were not bundled in with the device. These programs, these menus, all this bullshit was not bundled in. I had to put this all in because I had to take it from the H320 and then source it on my own from that fucking Chinese website and stick it into this device. So the only programs this thing would have come with would have been the command prompts, USB power, Explorer, and WLAN power. So that would have been it. That's it. Now the thing is that when you configure the device, you have to configure these devices. You have two different utilities, and these two different utilities work alongside each other, and you need them. You have, in the config tool, you have the actual config tool, and then you have the config loader. The config tool is a utility that sets up. It's like let me show. It's a utility where it shows you all these settings right here. This is how you set up the basic settings of this device. The control panel lets you change the settings in the CE OS, but that's it. In order for you to change things such as the scan wedge, or the buttons, or the clock speed, or the brightness, or the key light, any of that type of bullshit, this is what you need this tool for. If you do not have this tool, this device is basically almost, you cannot really use it properly. So this is why I had to get that utility, because this device in a way functioned almost useless, because I literally cannot do a whole lot with it unless I had this bullshit tool. So this tool lets you configure all this garbage. So you're able to enable the taskbar, the battery icons, wireless icons. Over here you're able to select where you want the taskbar, your backlight, your key lights, your buzzers, you know, when you want to wake up, whether you want to enable the touch panel, you know, that garbage. Okay, the keyboard config, this lets you actually set up manual keyboard layouts for the keypad itself. So over here you will see it imitates the numerical pad, 1 2 3 4 5 6 7, you know, that type of bullshit. Obviously I don't have to configure anything over here. Barcode emulation config, this over here, this is your scan wedge. So over here is where you would configure your scan wedge. Over here is where you would configure your symbologies. You know, that's where you would configure most of this garbage. And then the scanner setting, this is where you would configure how exactly you want this thing to respond to you whenever you scan it. So over here, you know, it shows you what's the frequency, whether you want it to show an LED, whether you want it to buzz, you know, all that type of garbage. And this is where you will also set up the individual parameters within the symbologies itself. So whether you want to enable a check digit, or you know, all that type of garbage. So every time you change settings in this thing, it creates an ini file. So oh my lord almighty. So it creates an ini file, and it creates it in your persistent storage, that being your F disk drive. You fucking Christ almighty. So it stores it stores it like in the where your config utility is based in. So I obviously have like the utilities in here. So you see, it creates these ones right here. It creates these files. So you will notice there would have been a little number in the corner. You're able to create separate profiles for each configuration. So mine is profile 1, and this is what configures the actual device itself for the scan and all that garbage. This is for the actual OS, like, you know, like for the keypad and for the backlight, that garbage. So here's the rule with this thing. You have the config tool, but the config tool only creates these files. In order for you to load them into the device, for the changes to take effect, you will need the config loader. The thing is that these, whatever changes you would have made into these ini files, will not take into effect even when you warm boot it. Because even when you warm boot it, if this program does not launch, then your changes are reverted back to default. So you will need config loader to be loaded every time the OS starts again from RAM. So your changes in a way are never saved. They are only saved in a file, not in the OS itself. So you will need this thing for you to actually load your changes. Why does Panasonic do it like this? I have no idea why. because this was quite literally the most convoluted, retarded system ever. But that's how they did it, so I don't know. But yeah, the thing is, my endpoint is that utility only changes things within the OS and the scan parts, like the scanner itself. It does not change any user changes. So for example, if I have WordPad on my desktop, this desktop shortcut, it does not restore that. So in order for me to have that, that's where the backup utility comes in. So the backup manager is the utility that changes all your this is the utility that saves all your data, like your user portion of the data. So what it does is that if I have a document in this thing called, I don't know, let's say it's just called penis, okay? And penis.txt obviously gets cleared whenever I cold boot. And when I warm boot, it's obviously still there. Now, during the event that when this thing cold boots, everything is gone. So there are two components that needs to be restored back. That being any changes I would have made on the scanner itself, such as the parameters regarding the display, the clock speed, the key light, whatever, and with any parameters made within the scan engine of the device itself. Now, that is for that portion. For the user portion, this is for any programs I have installed. This is for any documents I would have had. This is for any other user changes. That one has to be restored via the backup utility. So that's the thing. That's the thing. So in order for you to actually have this thing restore everything, I have this thing all neatly set up. So that means during the event that this thing cold boots, which it did recently, it literally just did last night, I don't know why, I literally was charging this fucking thing and then all of a sudden it decided to cold boot. I don't know what the fuck is going on there, but it did. You would need to have everything all in tip-top shape, everything all configured, so that means it will be actually functional. So the backup manager is very, very picky. So for example, if I have you see I have WordPad all neatly lined up in this portion of the desktop, in the left bottom portion. If I have WordPad in the right bottom portion, it's gonna save it like that, so it remembers the coordinates as well on the display, and you know, remembers other stuff as well. So essentially you are basically restoring from a state. You're not restoring settings or documents per se, you are restoring from a state, almost in the same similarity of a virtual machine. In, let's say, Oracle VMware, in VMware you have your Windows XP guest, okay? And let's say you want to use it for viruses or whatever. You will want to save a clean state of your guest before it gets infected with computer aids. So that means you won't have to make another Windows XP VM. So when you create a state, it saves everything. It locks it in time pretty much. So it pretty much locks it down to the cursor, to your cursor position. So that's what this thing does, pretty much. But that's only when it comes to the user portion. When it comes to the as I said, the device, the scanner, and the scan engine portion, it only follows by those parameters that is specified via that ini file. And as mentioned before, those ini files and those parameters are completely utterly useless if you do not have config loader, which config loader is a must that you would need to have in order for you to have this thing properly configured, because during a cold boot it's obviously not going to load it. But even during a warm boot, it's not going to load it either. You will need to load config loader every time you warm boot the device for your changes to go back to how you want it to be regarding your device and scan engine portion, because it's still always set to default. So in a way it never, as I said, it never actually saves your changes. You will need to save your changes, and you will need to reload your changes every time, regardless of a cold boot or a warm boot. Again, this is regarding your device and scan engine portion, not your documents portion, because your documents and user data portion are still going to be preserved via a warm boot. But your cold boots is obviously going to clear everything. So, you know, it's a very weird, fucked up, and stupid convoluted system, but that's how these things work. So, how exactly would you save everything like this on a Windows CE RAM-based OS? Well, this is why you need to save everything within your F disk drive, because your F disk drive is your persistent storage manager. So I have everything all neatly inside my F disk drive. So you see, this is where I keep my config files, the backups of them. This is where I keep a document backup in case if the backup manager fails to back up everything. This is where I keep the Office suite, basically the WordPad, because this thing did not even come with a WordPad, so I had to manually install it. And this is where the Panasonic suite of utilities are. So this is obviously where your backup manager, your config tool, your WLAN managers, and your Bluetooth manager. And these are obviously registry keys, and these registry keys are also needed because the backup manager also saves your registry keys. And even during a cold boot, it still keeps your registry. So as I mentioned, the cold boot still keeps some persistency, but not all persistency, which is fucking weird. And so you see, by default, this thing in the corner, the very right corner on the taskbar, you see these three little squares. These three little squares is your task switcher. By default, I don't know why, Panasonic does not have your task switcher enabled by default. And obviously on the taskbar it does not show you the task that you're running, which is fucking weird as well. So how you would per se actually navigate through it is you would have to go through all these keyboard functions for you to actually navigate through the OS. Now I had to obviously go into the registry and change these myself, because it is incredibly annoying to do all that bullshit. So yeah, I mean that's the thing though, okay? So how exactly would you make it that during a warm boot or a cold boot, obviously during a warm boot and a cold boot, you're going like during a warm boot, you don't have to restore anything from your backup manager. But during a cold boot, you are going to have to restore things from your backup manager, such as your documents. But during a warm boot and a cold boot, you're still going to have to reload your config loader. So what you will need to do is that you will need to have a batch script. And the batch script needs to be this. It needs to be called it has to be called startapp.bat. And from there, regardless whether it's a cold boot or a warm boot, it's going to look through your F disk drive, and it's going to find this file, and it's going to have to load it. So this is obviously what it contains. It contains the start. It contains my paths of where I want the programs to start. You will see I have named config loader for it to start in that specific path within my F disk drive, and then that obviously clears the script. So again, as I said, these devices, they operate in a very fucked up, weird, stupid ass way, but that's how they are. So these things are a completely weird, wild, different animal. They do not work. They do not work like in a. What the fuck is this piece of shit? They do not work in a normal way. They work in a stupid way. They work in a really dumb, stupid way. But yeah. So I am making this. So if anyone comes across this bullshit, they will know what to know, because these devices are weird as hell. That's why. Because the manual, believe it or not, the manual literally does not say any of this type of stuff. It does not even tell you how you cold boot or warm boot the device. The manual does not tell you how you will configure the device. The manual just assumes that you know. And this is why I'm saying that the manual is like literally the biggest piece of paper. You're better off wiping your ass with the manual, because there's literally nothing you can do with the manual. What the manual is only going to show you is how you would remove the battery, how you would pop in the battery, how you would scan a barcode, how you would turn on the device. That's it. And then at the very end, it's going to show you a spec sheet, and it's like, bro, no one fucking cares. That's the thing, though. So, as I said, these devices, they work in a very weird way, in an incredibly weird way. This does not only apply to the H300, it also applies to the H320. It's the same bullshit too. So, I don't know why the hell Panasonic had it this way, but they did. So, that's the thing. In terms of if anyone else has this device, I honestly do not know. These things, as far as I know, were only ever released in Japan and Europe. I think maybe in China too. And finding English variants of these things is way less common than finding a Japanese variant of this thing. So, yeah, but these things are literally the work of the devil. They are a pain in the ass to configure. But, yeah.